Dentist Robert Miller confessed to police that he had accidentally overdosed Cleo Sprouse on chloroform as he prepared to perform an illegal abortion on her. The prosecutors weren't convinced. They thought he was just using "oops, it was a botched abortion" as an excuse to cover up premeditated murder. What are your thoughts? This is Christina with the Sisyphean Journal, and today is March 1st. Late in the chilly morning of March 2nd, 1937, two engineering students at the University of Virginia at Charlotte decided to cross the low stone wall separating the campus from the cemetery to visit the grave of a friend who had recently been killed in a car crash. As the young men crossed the stile, they noticed something unusual. A young woman was lying amid the leaves on the campus side of the wall. They thought that she was probably sleeping. She had a towel over her face, so they decided to go visit the grave. But as they came back and looked again, they were disquieted. So when they went to class, they told their professor, who told the dean of engineering, who contacted the authorities. Sheriff J. Mason Smith had an idea who the young woman might be. The previous evening, a widow named Lula Sprouse had reported that her 18-year-old daughter, Cleo, was missing. Cleo had left the house at about 4 p.m., saying that she was going to a movie and she would be back at around 6:30. Now, Cleo was an honor student, a responsible young woman. She was somebody who was always where she said she was going to be, when she said she was going to be there. So her mother very quickly became worried. Her siblings, her friends, her neighbors all fanned out looking for her. One friend reported that she had seen Cleo in a brown sedan driven by a man that she herself couldn't see and had asked her to go for a ride, but the girl had demurred. She didn't have shoes on and didn't want to get out. Another acquaintance reported having seen Cleo near the theater, but nobody else knew anything. It seemed to Sheriff Miller that likely the body was that of Cleo. Upon arrival at the campus and cemetery, the police had to shoo away the crowd of curious onlookers, but fortunately they hadn't done anything to disturb the area. Sheriff Smith carefully began removing the leaves. The young woman lay almost primly. Her clothing was in perfect order. A small cloth the size of a hand towel was covering her face, and some object that was propped up on her chin. The young woman's clothing matched the description of the clothes that Mrs. Sprouse had described when she reported her daughter missing. A green polka dot dress, a brown cloth coat, brown stockings, brown suede pumps. Cleo's rings, one gold and another costume jewelry, were on the fingers. It was probably Cleo. Sheriff Smith removed the cloth, and there was a chloroform can upside down over the young woman's mouth. There were chemical burns on her nose and mouth. The young woman's face and her hair matched the description of the auburn-haired Cleo Sprouse. Unfortunately, her mother's worst fears had been confirmed. Cleo was dead. Meanwhile, the police fanned out, looking for other evidence. They took plaster casts of tire tracks near the dump site. They talked to everybody at bus stations, taxi stands, railroad stations. What had happened? Who had killed this young woman? And why had he left her there on campus? Had he put her on the cemetery side of the fence, the wall? It might have taken longer to discover her. He might have had more time to cover his tracks. The sheriff packed up the chloroform can, the towel, and other evidence and sent it off to the FBI in Washington, and he sent the body down to the morgue for an autopsy. it was confirmed this was Cleo, and she had died from an overdose of chloroform. But there were even more odd circumstances. There were traces of ether in the young woman's lungs, and the chloroform in question was not medical chloroform. It was what was called technical chloroform, which was frequently used to euthanize animals. It contained contaminants such as hydrochloric acid and phosgene gas. Nobody who knew what they were doing would try to use that to anesthetize somebody. Sheriff Smith went to the Sprouse home and told the distraught family what had happened. In between racking sobs, Cleo's mother gasped out what she had said before, that Cleo had come home from school, had left at about 4 o'clock to go to a movie, and when she hadn't returned by 7, the family went out looking for her. The police quickly got a report back from the FBI, at least about the cloth that had been covering Cleo's face. It was a dental napkin of the kind used by dentists to protect patients' clothing, and all 4 corners of the cloth had clamp marks on, matching the kinds of clamps that dentists use to position these cloths around patients' necks. They had also found a thumbprint on the bottom of the chloroform can. Now, when Sheriff Smith had it verified that this was the type of cloth used at a dental office, he figured, let's check the local dentist. He had photographs of the teeth of a man who had been killed in what was believed to be a hunting accident at the office. So he had copies made, and he sent his men to the 16 dentists that were operating in the Charlotte area with instructions to hand them to the dentist and ask if the teeth were familiar, and in that way get the fingerprints of the dentist. One set of fingerprints gathered this way matched the fingerprint on the chloroform can, and that was 52-year-old Richard Miller, DDS. Miller had a very positive reputation in town. He was active in his church, he was active in the local sportsmen's group, he was married, had 2 children, very respectable. People were outraged at the idea that he might have done this to the pretty young schoolgirl. Cleo, at age 18, had only been a junior in high school. As for Miller himself, at first he said that Cleo must have committed suicide. He'd been her dentist, he said, for about 9 months and had been treating her for gum problems. Miller even had a reason why the chloroform can would have been with his patient. He said that he kept it in his office to use as a solvent in mixing dental fillings. He said that once, while Cleo had been in his office in mid-February, he'd left her in the dental chair to go take a phone call, and when he'd come back, he found her closing the door of the cabinet he kept the ether in. And he said that the can of ether was later seen to be missing. Now, according to the clinic records, he had indeed been her dentist, but she had been coming to him for over a year, approximately twice a week. Now, that evening, the police went and they searched the dental clinic. They found that the dental napkins in that clinic were identical to the one found on Cleo's body, and that the clamps were consistent with the ones that left the clamp marks on the cloth that had been covering her face. So they arrested Dr. Miller and brought him to the police station. Now, meanwhile, a crowd had gathered outside the courthouse of angry townspeople and the press. Now, at first, Miller kept insisting that Cleo had probably stolen the chloroform in order to commit suicide. His story changed after he saw the crowd outside the police station. There were so many of them pressed up against the building that the porch actually collapsed under their weight. Miller didn't want to go outside into that crowd. He asked the police to keep him safe, so they hustled him out the back door, loaded him into a car, and drove him off to the county jail. On the way there, he started telling his story. He said that Cleo had come to him begging for him to perform an abortion. He said that at first he'd refused, but she had threatened to name him as the father of her baby if he didn't comply. He said that he had borrowed a car so that he could perform the abortion in the car and had driven to a spot about 6 miles north of the city. He said that within about a minute of administering the chloroform, Cleo had died. He stayed until after dark, pondering what to do, and decided he was going to take her to an undertaker, contact the authorities, and confess. But he said he panicked and instead went to the cemetery, dumping her body and trying to stage a suicide. Some of the story was actually corroborated. A bus driver had seen the brown sedan parked at the spot where Dr. Miller said he had performed the abortion. The bus driver said that the doors had been opened, the engine had been running. A service station attendant said that he had gassed up the brown sedan with Miller driving and Cleo in the passenger seat, and that they had headed north in the general direction of where Dr. Miller said that he had accidentally killed Cleo. Cleo's body became almost a tourist attraction at the undertaker's. She was laid out in an open coffin, and it seemed everybody in town was filing by. After school, the student body went and filed by. And eventually, Cleo's body was taken in the coffin to her family home, where, again, there was an invasion. Photographers from the press were there taking pictures of the family and taking pictures of the bereft widow sobbing over her daughter's coffin. At the burial, Mrs. Sprouse collapsed at the cemetery, and the pastor who was performing the ceremony actually had to stop during the service to chew out the photographers who were going around taking pictures and interfering. Now, Miller was indicted for first-degree murder. The police and the prosecutors were certain that he had killed Cleo deliberately. Why would he try to perform the abortion in a borrowed car instead of performing it in his dental office? Why would he use the can of chloroform that he had on hand as a solvent instead of using ether that he would use to anesthetize his patients? It just didn't seem to make any sense to them. Miller's attorneys bounced around the idea of claiming that Miller was not guilty because of insanity. They asserted that he had caused brain damage to himself when he'd accidentally shot himself while hunting. But there, the bullet had just grazed his temple. So that line of defense was dropped. They just stuck very firmly to the idea that this couldn't have been first-degree deliberate murder. It had merely been an accident, as Dr. Miller had been preparing to anesthetize Cleo for the abortion. Miller eventually pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. Initially, Cleo's mother had objected, but for reasons of her own, she decided that that was good enough. The 52-year-old was sentenced to 16 years in prison for the young woman's death. Now, was this deliberate murder? Or was he telling the truth, that he just got some wacky idea, and maybe he had used ether to put her under and then chickened out? Please tell me below, what do you think actually happened?